other things like that in office. First of all, to my right, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jeff Carroll. Mr. Jeff Carroll, a brief introduction, sir.
I'm a science fiction writer, horror writer, filmmaker, and I guess lover of the genre. More so science fiction than just superheroes. I'm a graphic novel reader, and I have 3 comic books, about 13 books, and I just shot my 4th movie.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and I've sat on another, not on another panel, but I was privy to meeting Mr. Carroll at another seminar that he did along with people who, that was reference of Star Trek, right?
Yes.
That was a Star Trek seminar that they had done at that time, and then reference to another seminar. He's also a mentor to not only to kids in reference to anything outside. You're a teacher also, right?
I was a middle school, high school teacher. I'm on leave right now, so I may go back, I may not. It depends on how well the movies do.
Both my parents are school teachers. Well, both retired now, but so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And now to my left, I'd like to introduce you to
My name is Edward Stinson.
My name is Michelle Lawrence.
We are Visual Adjectives, a publishing company. We publish not only a couple comics, but we also have our graphic novels and illustrated novels that we have. So we specifically go for illustrated novels, as that allows us a cool, interesting mix of artists and writers. So I myself am as well a middle school and high school teacher currently. That's awesome, man. That's so cool. I love that. Education is always the greatest thing. I think that's the foundation of all forms of art that we're going to be talking about. And then go ahead. She has to show me.
I'm a publisher. Publish all books.
Okay. The show me tell. So she's gonna pass around a little pamphlet. Little pamphlet basically, it says you have a story, now what? And so there's many different options to creating a story. So we'll be going over a bit more of that later on. What each of the options allow or can give for you. But yeah, sorry, that was good.
Yeah, that's it.
We'll continue on the timeline. Sorry, continue.
I've also been on several seminars with Michelle and Trey. They have been, they taught me so much also. We're part of also the Renaissance Festival that's coming up soon. We have Camelot Days and it's going on down the road, which we will probably or may partake this week. So not only do you see Visual Adjective as being a publishing company, but there also are learners of writing, drawers, everything. Like I said, I've learned so much from them in reference to not only the publishing company, but also learn how to write. Trey is taskmaster. I got more whips on my back for scars about how to write a sentence, the periods and this and that. So if you ever want to have your book published, if you want to start your book, you can start here.
I mean, basically, we are legitimately like any other publishing company. We do what they do, it's just we're local. So we do the same thing. Our books are published internationally. They're in,
Barnes and Noble,
Barnes and Noble's, Amazon, you can find them.
But all artists we have are all local artists, local
Yeah.
authors for now. So which is what is great and what we prefer to do. We want to help people who are in the area that we know, we have worked with. I have friends who are artists. So as we keep going, we're able to work with more and more local artists.
Okay. But with that in mind, I would just like to start a question off in reference to Mr. Carroll. I know Jeff has been hard at work doing things. You said you got some movies coming out. Can you explain your movies in reference to how, if anybody wants to get started with movies, how would they get to the movies? How you start out from step 1, going into step 2, step 3, and the finishing piece?
I'm an older person, so I have maybe 30-something years in entertainment and film and television production. And I don't think you have to go my route to do it. I started in high school as a reporter for a local black newspaper, and I graduated into reviewing movies. I reviewed movies like House Party, Boys in the Hood, and movies of that time period. I did it for just probably a few years before I decided I enjoyed movies too much to be in a small room reviewing movies with other reviewers. I am a child of 42nd Street. I'm from New York, so I like to be in the theater, feeling the energy. And I kind of had a bad experience with Prince. We were in a review for Under the Cherry Moon, which is follow up to Purple Rain, and I got there late. Probably so did a lot of people, and movie wasn't doing too well, and people were grumbling, and turned out that Prince was in the audience, and he took it personal. He got up and left the theater, and he said something to some of the people a little further down I didn't hear, but I was like, man, it takes away from the fun, because you never know who's gonna be there. You gotta kind of watch yourself, and I like to be authentic with that. And how I got into filmmaking from there is, I worked at the Apollo Theater, and at the time it was for about 10 years, 12 years, that I had worked on television production, and I decided to work with a couple of friends of mine, and we made our first movie. And I had my own entertainment agency where I represented comedians like J.B. Smoove. I worked with Monique, I worked with Bill Bellamy, and I had been putting them in movies, not those particular artists, but some of my other comedians. And I was like, man, these are medium level productions. And I was like, I can actually do something like this. So I reached out to a production company, sent them my idea, my script, and they made notes. I made the adjustments, and next thing you know, with my finances, I made my first movie, and that was in 2003. And then I made another movie in 2004, end of 2004, 2005, and that movie took off and did very well, won film awards, it was all over. And then I got kind of caught up in the writer's strike in 2008, and it kind of slowed my money down, and I just got into writing after that. I wrote books, and then I decided after Get Out, time to get back into film. And I made my third film, and then this summer I made my fourth film. My third film is called The Death Pledge, and that's coming out in a couple of weeks before the end of November, around Thanksgiving.
Now, the Death Pledge, is that more or less towards comics? Because I also know that some of your graphic novels that I've seen and read online, are they geared, well, first of all, let me say this. How did you get into comics and graphic novels and that side in reference to your filmmaking?
Okay, well, all of my films have been horror, okay? My first film was called Holla If I Kill You, and it was about a comedian that had a fall from grace. I worked on Def Comedy Jam, and I was at a taping when Chris Rock made fun of this comedian Shucky Ducky, who didn't do that well. And they never aired it, but Shucky Ducky bombed, and Chris Rock came up there and said, Shucky Ducky whack whack, and his whole tagline was Shucky Ducky quack quack. And it was real funny, everybody laughed, and I felt horrible because I had worked with comedians and had seen them rise and fall. So I thought how bad depression would be, could it flip somebody's switch and make them become a killer of other comedians? So I wrote this story about a comedian named Hollaback, and he has a fall from grace, ends up having to come back to the same clubs he got started, opening for comedians that used to open for him, and there's a whole lot of stress. My second film was Gold Digger Killer, and that was about a girl who gets raped and ends up seeking revenge on the guys that raped her. She doesn't go to Yana Van Zant, she doesn't go to Oprah Winfrey, no Dr. Phil. She goes and gets his gun and goes out and tries to rid the world of misogyny. That film did very well, and I was accepted to every film festival that I applied to. And the problem was I was running out of money, and the film festivals weren't really doing much for me at the time. So I decided what a good piece of merchandise would it be to have a comic book. and I commissioned the illustrator and wrote the comic book as a follow-up to the movie. And I, did about 4 or 5 comic books and comic strips at that period. And then the price of printing went up, and I kind of got out of comic books for a few years. And recently, now that the price of comics has gone up, because at the time when I had my comic book, comics were $2. This was in 2007, 2008. And now they've since gone up to $3.99, sometimes even $5. So that gives, the printing cost was like $1.50 a comic. There wasn't much of a profit margin. So now that the profit margin has increased, I'm able to get back into the business. So that's pretty much how it is. My first film, Holla If I Kill You, was screened at the very first Florida SuperCon. And at that time, SuperCon was combined with Spooky Empire, which is the state's largest horror convention. And I knew both of those individuals at the beginning, and as they grew, I continued to go to SuperCons, and I continued to go to Spooky Empires. And just walking around and seeing what sells, I started looking into it and, working.
Great. This question I'm asking visual adjectives, and like I know them. Their whole thing has been originality that we've been trying to work on. Original superheroes, original comics, original drawings. Can one of you all expound, once you get a chance, you'll see the artwork is awesome. Can one of you expound on the fact that in reference to originality, you're trying to develop new superheroes and new genres into what we already have, going with that, and why it's so hard to fit somebody new, like the Luke Cages, that are black, and I guess with the Black Lightning and things like that. So, how do we introduce someone new into that genre, if that makes any sense?
It's who you know, basically, in the comic industry. But I mean, going into, like he said, the comic industry is very expensive to get into. So to publish a comic is very expensive, especially if you're self-publishing. To pitch your idea to another company is not only time-consuming, but it's an iffy subject, because you have to have either an agent. So a lot of the comic companies, you can't just walk in the door, or actually now it's email, so you can't just email them, but technically walking in the door and saying, hey, I have a great idea. Because you can go on Facebook and look at 50 great ideas, and none of them are anywhere. They're just on Facebook. And you may think, I know, for instance, Mashundo, he has excellent artwork. He has some of the best artwork I've ever seen, and he is technically a nobody. He's going to events and conventions, and he's trying to show his work and trying to sell his work, but he's still,
He's not one of the big boys.
yeah, he's not one of the big boys, and technically he should be, because I've seen artwork. I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever been to a convention and you've walked past the table and you're kind of, why are you here moment. That's how some of his competition is, and that's who he's going up against, and he's still losing. So you have to look at the best of the best, compare yourself to the best of the best, and see where they are, and do, I want to say, kind of a reality check, and see what you're capable of, and are you capable of that?
And the potential that you should
Yeah.
have and that you should be working towards.
Yeah.
A lot of the issue also, like, again, when the second you want to go, how do we get new ideas created? Well, we have ideas like Captain America, Superman, that have existed for decades and decades, frankly. And you, as she said, have to consider it is who you know. It is knowing where to go to put yourselves in the circle of peers, in the circle of people who are in this field. If you are an artist, but you do not go to the areas that artists are in, you will not be noticed by other artists. So it takes the groundwork, it takes the footwork of going, I want to do this type of artwork, where do I need to go to do it? Okay, is it this location, this location, this location? I'll plan a time to go to these locations and showcase my work. That's why all these conventions now exist. It's why they took on so fast. It's why there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who visit them, because there was always a necessary location for people of these hobbies to come together. There's conventions for literally any hobby you can think of, any sport you can think of, any activity or art you can think of. There are conventions for it. But when it finally came to the more geeky side of comics and manga or anime or American cartoons, we needed a place for it. And then when we created the conventions, that's when we were able to go, okay, we can now see just how many of our peers are also thinking about these things. Just how many of them are also looking towards these things. Frankly, again, as you were saying, being a teacher, you also have a front row seat to seeing what the new generation of kids are like. All of the kids in my classes are always talking about either anime, comics, or Fortnite. Okay, you can clearly see the things they're interested in. Furthermore, they're always talking about the Marvel movies. You can clearly see that media is what shows them the heroes that they should care about. But then I also asked the main question. In the class, I said, name 20 male superheroes. I was able to be named within less than 30 seconds, they can name them. Then I said, name 20 female superheroes. It took them a solid 5 minutes to think of 10, okay? Then I said, name a hero with a skin color that is similar to yours. If they were of African American descent, they could straight up only name Storm or Black Panther, or hope to somewhat kind of remember any of the other names from Black Panther. If they were Hispanic, they literally had no characters that they could name. That was an issue to me. So all the kids in the classroom, I was like, if you can see how fast you're able to name the characters that are shown to you repeatedly, but you have no idea about characters that are actually similar to who you are as a person, there's an issue with industry. And you have to see that that issue is there. You have to know that it is there, and you have to either desire to want to change it or just accept that that's how the industry is. When it comes to trying to get into the industry, it is a fact that Superman is going to exist for another 50 years minimum. Okay, like by contract, his family, the people who made him, their families are going to be paid for as long as they're all alive. That's just how it goes. So no matter what, these larger companies who have the millions to continuously back any of their ideas, who have the millions to go, hello random artist off the street, sure, we'll let you draw this comic, we'll test you out, and then they can move on past them. They have the millions to be safe about that. But when it comes to new artists, new people doing it, as I said, the money is the biggest factor. You have the best idea all you want, but if you aren't also able to produce, also able to draw, also able to go and ink everything, also able to color it, also able to add words to it and proofread it, and then also have a production company able to produce, it is so hard to do it. There's a dozen jobs required for one comic to exist.
Most of you will stop at the getting a artist part.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
even then, money is an issue. It is
Because
hard to
getting
make a
an
person
artist-
spend that much time on your
Yeah,
comic.
it's
hard to do
expensive.
it.
And you're gonna have to pay them top dollars to
Mhm.
get your stuff done. Or you're gonna be paying them out of pocket every week as you can,
Yeah.
and then they're not gonna put your stuff on the front burner.
Mhm.
So you have to look at all the other options.
There's a lot of variables that go
You
into
know, editing, I mean, if you're gonna edit yourself, that's great, but are you actually an
it.
editor?
Are you a trained
How is your
editor?
grammar?
Went to
You
school
know?
for writing.
So all of that matters, you know, if you speak a different language and
Yeah.
you're trying to edit for the Americans, you know,
That can change things. And it does a
Yeah.
lot. If you ever if you know anime and what anime is, and then manga, people will always try to translate their language into ours, and they'll have the subtitles. But frankly, we are saying something different than
Yeah.
they are intending.
That's
We
all.
only translate as well as we can and hope we have the same meaning that they intend for the scene. You know, and even in the English language, that still matters. There's dialects when people talk. If you have a book on the East Coast versus the West Coast, there's certain words that go in the different lingos. So all these different factors matter when you're trying to create a
like
story.
little nuances, you know, I say gonna, I say
Gonna suppose
haven't. I
haven't.
mean,
It depends on where you
when
are,
you're,
you know.
yeah, when you're talking and you're writing is two different things. You don't, I am not going to go over there. Nobody talks like that. So when you're writing,
No.
you write like that. Yeah, you want to, that's how you write because that's what you were taught.
Mhm.
But when someone's reading a comic and they're like, what who talks like that? They want real world interaction. They're trying to escape in that moment.
Mhm.
And if
that's
you're,
for any book though.
yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
If you're trying to escape and I'm struggling to
Yeah,
read a
the
line,
language shouldn't be a barrier
Yeah,
past
exactly.
already trying to learn a whole new
It's
world.
not gonna work.
You know? Go ahead.
Well, about the the way different characters talk. See, I've always loved like the contrast between like the way that some characters talk like everybody else.
Exactly.
Like for instance, Captain America and Iron Man, they talk.
Yeah, they have a specific
Right,
lingo of how
right.
they talk to each other.
But then there's Thor.
Oh, yeah.
That goes into character development, and character
Exactly.
building.
And an
Yeah,
editor
you
knowing
have
how
to.
you talk,
Yeah,
how you
you
talk.
Exactly, and,
have to speak that way.
also, like Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch, they're Romani,
But
so
that's
they
where, yeah.
talk,
Research.
Mhm.
exactly.
I mean, I hate to say, I don't wanna sum it up and make it sound like general,
Is that gentleman?
but it's research, because
Mhm.
if I'm from another country and I'm writing about America, I have to speak American English.
Mhm.
I can't be
Versus the
from
Queen's
the Queen's English, you know,
Right.
so again, if you're Russian, and I know he can talk in a Russian accent very well, I cannot. So in my head, when I'm trying to speak like a Russian, I speak like Drago from Rocky. That's the only Russian person I know, so literally, that's how my character, yeah, you have to speak like that. So you have to role play. There's a lot in producing, and that's why most people, when you're producing your comic, it's almost, you're practically,
Like I said, there's a dozen jobs that
Yeah,
are
you're
required
gonna
to
be
make
doing a
one
lot.
book.
Yeah.
Okay? If you don't have the Adobe Suite, you can't do anything about your book, and you're just writing in Word and
Yeah.
hoping that it somehow can
Translate.
teleport itself into a book.
easily.
It takes so many steps in between.
Oh,
Oh,
she
sorry,
had-
Shayla, go ahead.
So I know you guys are you're focusing on like the physical book, but how do you guys feel about like webtoon or like web comics or
that-
something like that?
Equally, it takes just as many jobs, but each of them have a slightly different role.
Yeah.
If you're gonna still have to have someone who
Illustration.
edits your book, an illustrator, someone who
Yeah.
writes the whole book.
Then
someone
you're gonna have a web
Someone
designer.
who cares about coloring, someone who cares about inking, penciling, depending on how detailed you want to get. Someone, you need a web designer now, you need someone who's gonna actively maintain the website, because you can pay a web designer one time, they'll make a website and then they'll disappear. You know?
No, the only thing I'm saying is
Oh,
because
go
like I read webtoon and like they allow you to upload your
Yeah, yeah.
own comic,
Which is
So-
awesome.
Yeah, but you still
absolutely.
have to produce it. That's
Yeah,
all.
yeah, yeah. It's
You
good,
still have
yeah,
to make
yeah.
it.
Of course,
You know what I'm saying?
absolutely, it is something you can do. But just like, whether you're a film producer, whether you're a book producer, you have to have the knowledge of all the variables required to make your story a story that people are gonna wanna see. They have comics all the time on Webtoon, but you don't read all of them. Something pulls your eye to one or two out of the hundreds and thousands you're gonna see.
Yeah.
What's gonna make that one interesting? The main things they're gonna care about are the art, specifically the color in the art versus the lines in the art, because Eddie is very different than Powerpuff Girls, is very
Yeah.
different than Teen Titans, is very different than Young Justice, is
And
very
I
different than Naruto
hate
and My
Eddie.
Hero. See, and so she has very specific preferences.
I get schizophrenic watching that
Same
cartoon.
team,
love-
same.
I can't
love
stand
it.
watching that because I'm just like, who came up with this
See, so,
concept?
but that matters though.
It's so
So then you have to
annoying.
consider what
Yeah.
can work in the current time. Because
Yeah.
I also have Webtoon now. I'm slowly working on it inside. But, I have to know, where can I publish it actively? Yes, I can publish it there.
Who's gonna read it?
What are the rights do they have on my work? Because
Yeah.
yes, they can
That's
just
a
go ahead
big
and say,
factor.
yeah, sure, publish on a website. Do
Now they
you
own
now
your work
own my
because
work?
you published on
But
their
with
site.
that-
I don't know.
But would that be something easier versus trying to do something hard?
That goes back to,
It depends completely on the work.
Oh, I'm
that's
sorry, I
going
just
to-
walked in. I apologize.
No, that's fine. I'm glad you're asking.
yes, because
Uh,
we're
it
gonna
completely
use
depends
that.
on the work you're trying to do. Again, if there's 12 different avenues you can take, but all 12 require 12 different jobs you gotta know. And then all 12 of those jobs require, different efficiencies in the levels of those jobs. So whether you're going to do, thank you, I love you. Whether you're gonna do a webcomic, which is what you're talking about, that takes a whole different thing. If you're doing a standard comic, you gotta know what place to sell comics. If you're doing a graphic novel, you gotta know if you can be in Barnes & Noble, what place you can sell that. Illustrated novel, it's not a huge comic, it is a novel, but oh my gosh, a bunch of pictures. Versus a full novel is just words. Be ready to read 800 pages and immerse yourself and forget you live in the real world.
And for us as publishers, one of the main things I always tell people when I sit with them is like a consultation before I even deal with getting anything from people, is I listen to what they have, which is like their synopsis, their elevator pitch basically. And I go, that is better off as a comic, or that is better off as a book. For instance, this book was a comic. For years, Edward, he's walking
My dad
somewhere.
is-
This was his comic book. When I met him 30 years ago,
My dad,
He
by the way,
was-
not me.
yeah, not him, there's two Edwards, but
Both are-
the dad, he was drawing this as a comic. And us, we take a piece of paper fold it in half, and start drawing on it,
The old
and then we
times.
add pages as we go, and that's what it was. We still have it. And it was a comic book that he was drawing. And then, as time went on,
And we
and
got wiser,
We got
better as
wiser,
writers and
doing the
artists.
editing, I was like,
Dude, let's just make this a book.
There's so much story.
There's so much you could say.
it's a book. So we took all the pictures that he drew, and this is one example. Like, we just took all the pictures that was in the comic and literally
And these are like the
made it a book.
Yeah, these are like 11 by 17 size pages.
Yeah, this
These
is
are
how
all
big they
comic.
are.
This is comic
So I'm
paper.
saying,
So you
that's
have to
why I
draw
said,
this big.
you have to draw
That's Edward right there.
realistically.
It's like this is the cover to the book
Yeah, this is
versus
the
the
cover.
book itself.
You see
This
how
is
that
the
starts out?
black and white version of the picture. Then you put it on the computer and you can color it.
So it's a
as
lot
you
of
need.
work, you know, because if he wants to draw this, let's say he can't draw, but I have this idea. Okay, so he can't draw, we gotta find an artist. Then we find the artist charges us, that's money out of our
And you also have
pocket.
to hope
Like
that
he
the artist
said.
is able to draw it in the way you want.
Yeah,
So
and
not only do you have to
so
look for
then you
artists,
have to color it.
Yeah.
Okay,
you have to hope
luckily-
that they can also color.
They
it.
can
If
color
they
it.
can't, you just gotta
So,
figure that out as
yeah.
well.
I, wait a minute,
Go ahead, brother, I'm sorry.
And I will just say, on the other side, because we live in a world where technology has kind of evened things out. All right, I've had publishers, I've had distributors, what else? And I was an agent, right? So I've been on the other side and putting artists out there. But now technology is out there. And the thing about going the independent route is that you have to be your own CEO. You know, we've seen now Chance the Rapper, to give you an example. I used to work at Sony Records, okay? Sony Records is one of the biggest record company out there, right? They had Epic, I was at CBS, they had Russell Simmons, Def Jam, all underneath the umbrella. But they were doing what corporations do. They have an opinion, no, I think you'll be better in this outfit. I think you'll be better with this single. There's a lot of artists, like Chance the Rapper, who say, oh no, I know what my art works best for me. I want to put it out myself. Years ago in the 90s, you couldn't do it that way.
Yeah.
Now you have routes like web comics. You can put it up on Facebook. You can put it up on social media. You can sell it at conventions. The printing costs are low. I know a lot of financially successful, independent creators, whether they are illustrators that hire writers, whether they're writers that hire illustrators. Everybody hires printers, right? We have Kickstarter. Kickstarter is a beautiful way. You make a little video with your phone, you tell people what you want to do, and they buy into it. You may start very humble, but then you move on. So what you have to do on the independent route is you kind of have to know everything that a publisher knows. But even if you have a publisher, you should still know everything
Absolutely.
a publisher knows. Matter of fact, if you have a publisher, you should know more than you should know even as an independent artist.
Right.
Because now you have somebody spending money for you, making decisions for you, and advising you. And if you don't have an opinion, then you might as well just let them be you.
Right.
So as an independent artist, I've released my comic books myself, and yes, I've made mistakes. But are mistakes exclusive to independent published artists? Heck no. Publishers make major mistakes.
Yeah.
You understand? You
Bigger
think
mistakes.
every book or every artist or every movie that a company releases makes the money that they think it's gonna make?
No.
Heck no. The cool thing is, as an agent, as a corporation, you have other artists coming through. So if you don't hit with this artist, you got another artist keeping the light bill on. You understand? But if you're the artist, you don't want to be shelved. You don't want to be, you know what, we're going to push your release back. You know, or this and this happens. You don't want to get that Hollywood shuffle, right?
Right.
So how I find my artists, I've gone through referrals. They have an app called Fervor, and you can go in there, you can bid internationally. On Facebook, I've come, my illustrator here is from South America. He's from Brazil, right?
Wow.
Okay, I haven't talked to him. Text, sent him my script, paid for it. Probably about half the price that I paid for the illustrator I used that was from Tamarack. You know, I had to get my ideas out there. I think that is an issue that's coming up now. in terms of cost, because, everybody wants to charge the same rate, and I don't think everybody has the same experience, and nobody's saying anything about it. I put my middle finger up to a lot of filmmakers, because one of the classes they don't teach in filmmaking is screenwriting, story writing. They teach the mechanics of it,
true.
but don't teach the real story arc. Same thing with illustrators. A lot of illustrators know great shadow, great sequential art pages, but can they think of a good story? That's a different. So as a writer, I put a lot of value around myself, and I say, you know what? I can carry a medium illustrator, just like illustrators that are great can carry a medium story. I think my story can carry a medium illustrator, and there's beautiful examples of that. If you look at IDW or Image, they don't have the best artists, but some of their stories. Look at Walking Dead. Walking Dead doesn't have the best artists, but it is probably the number one selling comic book out there. And I can give you examples over and over again of different things. So yeah, you can put your comic book out there. If you've got a couple of $1,000, you're willing to invest it, and you're willing to go out to conventions, or if you're real charismatic and you got a real strong friendship base. Imagine if you're one of these social media influencers, right? I met a kid at one of these high schools that I spoke at, had 1 million followers. The possibility of him doing a comic book is tremendous. All he has to do is know the mechanics and put up a Kickstarter, and he could raise him $5,000 and cover any kind of comic book that's out there. So there's ways to do it. I would definitely say, in addition to our answers, Google, right? Go to YouTube, learn like my son's learning. He learns how to do almost everything on YouTube tutorials. So you'll get our opinions. I would go to Kickstarter and study people that are doing it. I would go to conventions and meet people like ourselves, because this is a different world than it was before. Sure, with publishers and experienced people like myself, you'll make less mistakes, but sometimes going to the school of hard knocks is expensive, but it's still sometimes cheaper than tuition, right? So you may make some mistakes and it may be costly, but you know, when you go to college to learn illustration and comic book production or publishing, you know, that may come with a $10,000 tuition fee. So, you know, are you gonna make $10,000 worth of mistakes? Nah. Hopefully you can learn by $1,000. You know? I'm gonna tell you, it's not, if you have a good idea and you learn how to harness your idea, that's not something you can learn from a publisher or an independent person. That's your idea. You understand? So you just have to learn, like you said, how he picked up a pen. If you into stories, you got good dreams. You sleep with a notebook next to your bed, and you start writing those down. And the next day you go to work or you go to school, you start telling people your ideas. And if you got a crowd around you, now you got a book worth selling. That's how Sister Soldier did The Coldest Winter Ever. She told her story orally to summer campers year after year. And everybody knew it at her summer camp, but the world didn't know it. So she still wrote it down. And guess what? She started a literary genre called street lit. She's the queen of street lit from an oral story that she told sitting around like a griot in Africa. So yeah, practice, put your stories out there. I know I do a video blog on YouTube where I tell people exactly where I get my stories from, how I think as a writer. Start listening to those people that are out there and take everybody's advice. Because there's more than one right way.
Okay.
I had a question that's kind of lighthearted, but it goes back to the thing about dialogue we were talking about.
Sure.
Do any of you consider yourselves frustrated voice actors?
Most of the time, when you're telling a story to yourself, like you have to have all your emotions when you're talking about all your characters. The best way I have my characters is when I literally try to act them out.
Yeah.
You know, and so like acting them out helps you understand them as a character. And so as you're making a story, if you have 4 characters, legitimately try and act out each of the 4, try and have the mannerisms of them, try and have how they sound, all the lingo. It absolutely matters.
I studied comedy in the Uptown Comedy Club. Shout out to the Brown Brothers in Harlem. And we used to do an exercise where you would just see two people sitting at a table in the mall, wherever, and you would try to figure out what they were talking about. And I don't say it's a frustration. I say it's an energy, and it's a passion, a desire. When you talk about voice actor, when you talk about your characters, it makes me think of the characters that I have written,
Yes.
that I have their stories to finish.
Yeah.
So I thought of a story, and this character is coming to me in my dreams. Every time if I'm cutting my lawn and I got 20 minutes, I'm on a long drive by myself, whatever, those characters are yelling at me. You know, they're telling me their lines, and I have to transcribe it and I have to get on it. But I don't look at it as a frustration.
Okay.
I look at it as an energy, a buildup, a passion.
Yeah.
You know, it's a strong desire. It's good.
Yes.
Because if you don't get that, then what the heck are you writing?
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know, so your characters ain't speaking to you. You may not be writing anything that's that good.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, me being a child of the '80s, I like the style of voice acting from the cartoons from that era is like very special to me, and it's like, well, okay, basically, I can do like 75% of the characters from the original Transformers.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the voice actors back in the 80s, which I also listened to and whatever, they did multiple characters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
put me in all a bunch of
So
different
again,
shows.
it goes
That's
back
the same
to,
memories.
it's not really frustration, it's, like I said, it's almost going through multiple personalities. You have to have the personality of each one, and it goes back to the writing. And the writing for different characters, you have to switch modes,
Yeah.
and then you have to be able to stick the modes for that person, switch, and then talk back to them in a different.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
Yeah,
respond.
like
Yeah.
Frank Welker, he's one of my heroes. He was did like so many characters talking to each other. It was him. He was Megatron. He was Soundwave.
Oh,
Yeah,
involved.
exactly. Yeah, they did
So I didn't
multiple
know how to involve them
characters.
separately.
And you didn't know it was the
Yeah,
same person.
exactly.
It was that good, yeah.
Exactly.
Sometimes you can find yourself having too many characters also that can take away from the story.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
very
That's
true.
good about it.
That's
Game
good.
of Thrones is a prime
Good point.
example. Like, Game of Thrones is
Yeah.
a lot of people say it's a great show, it's amazing and fantastic, but like, to a degree, you also have to realize when something has too many characters or too little characters, or when the writers of the show themselves, like, you could clearly see where the writers started rushing the show. You can't have a show with 30 different storylines and then try and wrap it all up in only 8 episodes.
There's a reason the
Even
book's
in
not done
even
yet.
in books
As-
too.
No, but that's the thing,
And
there's
the
a
books aren't
reason,
done.
there's
They
a
haven't-
reason the books aren't done.
Yeah.
Because the
They
man
are that
knows, yeah,
intense.
the man knows how intense he wants his story to be.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to rush through the story
It
and
simply will not end well.
it's not gonna end,
going
yeah.
Because I found some authors, me being an avid reader, and I read a lot of books. I found having too many characters in a book can take away from the story.
That's
Yes.
because they
You know-
can't separate main characters.
Yeah, and I don't
From
have time to
yeah.
jot down characters and trying to
Yep.
remember.
Yeah, you have to be able to separate them.
But
Yeah.
I'll say this, I'll take Game of Thrones failure any day of the week, okay?
Yeah, facts,
So,
facts.
I will say
Facts.
that, I will say there's a measurable flaw in all art.
Yeah.
Even Prince and Michael Jackson aren't perfect,
Right.
okay? I don't care how many times James Brown rehearsed,
Yeah.
there's still an area that at some point as a creator, right? I'm talking about all art, you have to stop and accept that there will be a commercial value at this point. Writing is as much a hustle as anything else. We call it the magic of writing. So maybe the character overload did not work for you. We're not worried about pleasing an individual. We're worried about pleasing an average sum. So when we talk about Game of Thrones, yeah, maybe it didn't work for y'all, but it's
Oh,
the
it worked.
number one. Okay, I mean, I'm down for perfection, people.
Yeah, facts.
But failure on the level of Game of Thrones is a high bar.
still a high bar.
I used to have a partner who didn't want to do anything until it was there. And he didn't realize that just like voice acting, just like illustrating, just like writing, it's a craft. You start and you continually hone your craft and get better and get better. Understand that perfection is achieved.
Right.
It's not birthed. So some point, there's gonna be a price and a value to what you're doing at every stage.
And it goes back to who you know.
Right,
Because
or who you believe you are.
this man, I'm sorry, like, I agree to some extent,
Of course.
but, like, I've read fantasy, like, I'm a fantasy reader, okay? I started out with, there's a series called Dragonlance. Dragonlance is far better and simpler than Game of Thrones. Anybody that reads fantasy has heard of Dragonlance. The artwork, the writers, the story, the plot, the character, and they have multiple characters. But you know what they did? Each character got their own book. Each character was so intricate, they were so detailed as far as the character development, they were able to get their own book, whether it was one or two characters together. They would go on an adventure together. Game of Thrones is I started reading the book, and before anybody knew what Game of Thrones was, it was Fire and Ice.
Right.
And I started reading it, and I thought this was the worst fantasy story I ever read in my life. And I stopped. And then they came out with the show, and I would ask him, from the beginning, I said, this is stupid. Anybody that watches this show, and if it takes off, they have to be somebody that's never read fantasy. And if you look at the people that are saying this is the #1 show in history, and no offense to anybody, because I know he has some of those friends, I will tell you, it's simple. It is so,
By fantasy standards,
So
it is-
simple.
by
It's not
fantasy
even
standards,
fantasy.
It is fantasy. By fantasy
it's not
standards,
fantasy.
it is like
Only because it
fantasy.
has dragons and
It-
she walked out of the fire.
It is like fantasy.
I'm
There's-
triggered, I'm
there's-
sorry.
There's high fantasy,
I'm
such
sorry.
as Dragonlance,
Whew.
such as Lord of the
Starting to
Rings,
sweat.
where every aspect of the world is fantasy.
No.
But in Game of Thrones, legitimately, if you really think about the world, all of it is just basic medieval Europe
Yeah.
until randomly there's a
And you
random
had two
witch
black
who
people.
sets one on fire.
In the entire, it's not even like they had
Factual.
America
Factual.
and Africa.
No, they were
had
attached. Like
both
the lands,
continents.
the lands are attached. Like Dorne, like if you look at Dorne, here's
Let's not
Westeros.
talk about
It's
this.
still attached.
We can
Still
talk about
attached.
this later.
Dorne
Yeah.
is right
That's all
here.
I'm saying.
But they
Yeah.
never talk about Dorne.
We'll
I-
talk about
So
this later.
Yeah, because I have a quick, and Jeff has to leave.
Okay.
But this is something I think that might be important, and correct me if I'm wrong. As you can see, and this is what I was taught by my second family again. When you're dealing with a comic, they start calling these things panels. And you see how they're written, and see how they're all broken up? And like she was saying, a comic, because you have to do this as compared to a novel. So, can you tell me within about 5 minutes,
Yes.
the difference between, and then I'm gonna take it over there, difference between what you see here, and like what Michelle said before, when they had it this, theirs became this. So, go ahead.
A comic book script is very much like a movie script. You're giving direction to not the actors, but you're giving direction to your illustrator. So in the script, you will have like this. This is my fan fiction
I'll hold
called Medea's
I'll hold it up.
Paranormal Solutions, right? And it's my pitch. It's a fan fiction, so it's free, right? My pitch to Tyler Perry. So to the illustrator, who I've never met, Medea's sitting in the living room watching a TV show with ghost hunted homeboys on it. Then it says underneath, Medea says. Then what she says. Panel 2. Medea is whatever her Hattie is coming in with a pot of collard greens. And then what Medea says. Panel 3.
I get
Blah
what
blah blah. And
You
again,
direct
that's a
the story as it
Googleable
goes.
answer. I may say close up on Medea, right? Because Medea likes to rank on people. You know, so I wanted to have a whole page, a whole picture of her just sit down this, you know, and then them coming back and them saying stuff to Medea. Because I felt that that is what would convey the story. The story is called The Case of Disappearing Collard Greens. And I wrote it as a comic strip. It's not a comic book, it's a 2-page comic strip. So hopefully that answers that, you know, when you are writing a comic book script, you're directing the illustrators, right? Whether it's the pencilers, the inkers, or the colorists, even sometimes the letterers need a little direction because they need to know if it's a thought bubble, if it's a dialogue bubble, or if it's narration. And when you write
Explain thought bubble right quick.
a thought bubble is something that the character says to themselves.
Yeah.
It's just like you thinking in
Like Snoopy.
right, Snoopy, you would see bubble circles, right? And a narration bubble is meanwhile back at the ranch.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
1984,
Yeah.
3 days later.
Yeah.
All of that stuff that is for the reader to read. Now, when you write in prose, there's different ways to write your narration. There's quotation marks to write your dialogue. You understand? So all of those things are available using different techniques. And even in a screenplay, there's different ways that you're doing that because understand you're directing your crew in a screenplay. So there you have it. Hopefully that answers.
Oh, same thing?
Well,
Uh-huh.
comic as opposed to what,
Well, again,
remember, he
like I
said
said,
thought bubble.
yeah, like I said,
Because
this
there's no
one
thought
started
bubbles
out,
in books,
yeah,
are
this
there?
one started out like that. It started out as a comic, and Edward can kind of chime in if he wants, but it started out as a comic, and as this one was growing up, he was telling him the stories of this book. And I was like, "Ew, that's a lot for one little panel." So it's the same thing. It's, you can't talk about one thing, you know, this one picture literally is like this whole page to try to describe something. So if you're trying to describe something and you find yourself, and this is, if you read what this says, it starts out webcomic, standard comic, graphic novel, illustrated novel, full novel. It's kind of a progression. You start out what you know, webcomic, like you said, I went to webcomic. But if you find yourself going, I might have more of what he's talking about, that would be a standard comic. And then from there, you're going, okay, I might have a lot of pictures that I want to convey across to my audience with a lot of dialogue. Okay, let me do a graphic novel. Then from there, you're kind of like, I have an entire chapter with some pictures. That's more of an illustrated novel. But then if you're like, I just have a lot to say, then you're in Game of Thrones wrong.
So you,
And that's a
you
full
really want to
novel.
consider how much you are going to be writing. That is also what you want to care about. As he said when he was describing the comic panels, you can describe these comic panels in a sentence to a paragraph. Each of these panels, you can have the description for it. And then a comic artist is going to then illustrate from that. However, if someone wanted to write out this story, they would have to describe the entirety of the scene that Medea is in, how Medea is sitting, what her hands are doing, then also have the dialogue properly handled, how the other people are responding to that dialogue, then what Medea says there. You have to figure out what art form, what medium you prefer. If you are not an artist, more often than not, you're gonna make a novel. If you are someone who loves the magic and rhythm of words, more often than not, you're gonna make a full-on novel with words and chapter book versus someone who makes comics. Go ahead, brother.
And I also say that think of stories outside of the medium, right?
True.
I just did a movie called The Death Pledge. It started off as a short story. Then I wrote a comic strip to go with it that later became inserted in the movie. The story is universal. Stories have no medium. We decide to adapt those to a medium. So if you ever heard of a screenplay, they say the screen adaptation.
Yeah.
Meaning the story might have existed in another form, or it may not have. It's an oral story, so you have to adapt it. You can go mechanically, and if you are writing mechanically, you set up the room first. You're doing that. You have to follow those guidelines
Yep.
to a screenplay and to a comic strip. But when you're writing a book, you can start, bam, "'Twas the night before Christmas," or I forgot the long sentence. But you can start it off with dialogue and then find your style way to explain whatever the description of the room is. Again, I say it like this: if it ain't important to the story, then you don't need to know what kind of socks the character is wearing.
Yeah.
Now, in a movie, you might need to know micro details because high definition catches
See 'em.
everything.
Yeah.
But in a book, I'm not gonna waste time and tell you all this unnecessary information. I'm making you enjoy it, right? I'm massaging. I'm drawing a picture. So that's it.
On that, with a lot of books, plenty of times, they actually won't even fully describe the main character. And they'll leave it up to your imagination. And they'll just say, Bob does blah, 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 blah. His eyes were tired from the day. And they will just never describe the character's eyes. And that's fine, because it lets the reader completely imagine whatever they want with the character.
Yeah.
You know, all they might say is, it was a girl. And they'll continue forward from the entire story, her long hair. They won't say if it's curly hair. They won't say if it's high up top or long down low. They won't say any of that, and they'll just keep going with the story.
That
You know,
depends on the reader too,
Yeah,
because some
completely depends on
readers
the reader.
want that information.
Exactly.
You know.
So you gotta look for the
Yeah.
story that some
Exactly.
stories will have information, some won't. Some still have an image in their head of how a character looks, versus others are just like, he was tall and his build was strong. He kept his hair short and he always had a stern face about him that made people scared of his presence. You have no idea
Yeah,
if he's black,
But let
white,
me ask
Asian,
you-
Indian,
But let me
you know
ask- but let me
who
ask
he
you this.
is.
But let me ask this,
Go ahead.
and I think you and I, but you've taught me so much again. Can a writer overload a reader with too much information?
That goes for
Yes.
any art form
Yeah.
ever that
Yeah.
exists. There's always a point where there is too much. As he said
Yeah.
earlier,
Yeah.
you got it so concise that that's exactly what everybody needs to worry about.
Yeah.
When does commercial value begin, and how much of that quality do you want to care for before you need to accept it and just release your work? Because I can continue to add to any picture I see. There's an infinite amount of lines I could add to a picture, but at some point I need to go, is my idea on the paper, and does someone who looks at this paper, will they understand what I'm trying to say? If I can say yes, oh, go ahead.
Well, I said, now you as a reader, do you like to read more of, using more of your imagination, or do you want everything to be thrown there?
I don't want it all to be thrown, but catch me in the first chapter in order for me to continue reading. Give me something within the first chapter.
Of course.
Because that's gonna tell me like, wow, okay, boom.
Yeah, you usually
I'm
catch your
putting
read
these
by
other
the
books
first
down,
chapter.
but this author caught me with this book.
Yeah.
But now if you giving me too much like, you drag me on, I don't like a slow story in the beginning either, because like, you ain't giving me nothing to go to the next chapter.
Well,
You know, so that most books have to be caught in the first, for readers, you have to catch them within the first 2 chapters with something, to wow them.
Go ahead.
I will say this, that's all writer's style, right? Also, when it comes to.
I know
guess-
all authors don't write the same.
No, look, we got, who was it? Terry McMillan, no, not Terry McMillan. One of them doesn't use correct punctuation,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
And they play with it, but because of the way they are good at telling their stories.
You don't
they-
even catch it.
You don't care. It's just like some rappers don't write their rhymes down. You know,
Right,
it's all style. But I will say, no story really has a beginning or an end. If you don't want it to.
That's very important.
At some point, you're telling them, and this brings in
Yeah,
the
but
message
sometimes
in your story.
Having too many books, with some authors having like 4, 5, 6, these series, I mean, you can end the series, don't continue, because now
Yes.
the reader becomes bored,
Why do you think they do that?
because it's money.
And
Yeah,
why do you
that's
think
it.
they get the money?
Because people want to keep reading.
Thank you. I had a writer. Look, I had a
No,
writer.
but some
Start a
series
new
can,
story.
no, some writers can continue because they have nothing else to talk about, but it drags out.
But it is
No, and-
successful.
It might be, but after a while,
Chris has something.
And
to
I
say.
agree with you.
Go ahead, Chris,
I read
go.
too many different genres,
Go ahead,
okay?
Chris, go.
Okay, she talking about these series. She gotta remember, we reading a series now,
But it's but this series is good.
but
By
this,
Helen Hart. This series,
Anyway.
she's on book number 10 now. I think
But do
there's
you
all-
hear the contradiction
But
though?
anyway,
The second
okay,
it was
She
a
likes
book,
to read
that's what I'm
series of
saying.
books though.
That's
So-
all.
It
She
depends
likes
on
the series,
It
though.
depends on the genre. It depends on the genre.
but okay,
because I read
this,
different
okay,
authors.
but this, we haven't gotten, Jazz and I have not finished this particular last series that she read, right? She go,
Sorry, I got
oh,
kids and stuff.
she go,
I
oh,
Sound like misery.
It's
She
not.
got to find the writer. And
It's
you're like,
not
you gonna
like
write
the other
this
book.
character.
Finish this.
it's not like the other book.
No, but I've reached out to authors also, you know, because if you're gonna write a series, how long of a wait does a reader have to
She
wait?
probably done wrote Helen and asked Helen.
I have a problem, yeah, we gotta
Okay.
wait till next year for that one. But
Okay, here we go. We have an author in the house.
I talked to him already.
Wait,
I know she
But
wasn't
every
here.
author, no, But every author does take a distance, you know,
But
a
wait a
time
minute,
period.
we have an author in the house. This is your first
Yeah,
book?
I'm on my second book.
Okay, now, reference series, and I kept hearing, if it's where I think it came from, you could write a whole series about that, because I grew up in that area.
Yeah.
So, well, my question is this, remember, James Patterson has taken the Murders Women's Club. Wait a minute, see.
He got
Wait a minute,
ghostwriters.
see, wait a minute, but wait a minute.
Yes,
see,
I agree.
I understand it.
He's
You
made it
right,
happen.
but wait a minute, let me say this, you're
Can't go on
right,
that check.
you're right.
Can't
You-
go on
you
that.
right.
Alice Cross,
No,
you
no,
think
no, wait a
Alice
minute,
Cross
I'm just talking about the length of the series.
Yeah.
He's taking the murders, he's taking the women now, from 1, they're 20 right now. I'm like, really?
Can you pick somebody else?
They're going like, because I only said that because I followed him through Alex Cross and that,
Well,
and
look,
every time I look
no,
up.
let's go on something that's more realistic. Let's go on back to those. No, look.
But
If
they're
we
all
talk about those
successful.
All right,
those
yes, they
murder
are.
mysteries,
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
that's a
More
great
successful.
series. Where you have a detective, and you're following the detective through a series of crimes or a series of cases.
He didn't write all them books.
No,
But he
he's
wrote
not. Well, what I'm
them.
saying,
This is
a lot of
playground.
writers,
Yes.
what they end up doing after a certain point,
They can be like CSI.
they want to write
like
other
Criminal
things.
Minds.
Yeah.
They want to write other things, and they can't. So what they do with James Patterson, he's just old. The man is old.
Oh, he
and
is.
he's like, you know what? I'm gonna, hey,
New writer.
submit your
person.
story to me. And if you look at it, because I went to this stupid thing,
I
and
did that
this is
too.
what happens. He has you submit a short story to him. His team will read it, and it has to match certain standards within his world. And you have to write, if you write about this character, these things have to be concise. So once you fill those, it's like a resume basically. And then he gets it and he goes, okay,
Yeah.
we'll make you an offer.
It seems believable.
So now you're a ghostwriter for James Patterson.
Mhm.
And he will basically publish your book,
And just put his name on it.
but his
Put
name
his
is gonna
name-
be on
put
it.
his
Okay,
name.
And that's what, and he gets his money. But again, it goes back to, it's who you know. It's who you know. And I don't care what anyone says. This is why we do what we do. And this is why I give people this, because you have to know business. You have to know what you're doing. You can't drive a car without a license. You can't drive a car without practicing. You cannot go into publishing without your research,
Okay.
basically.
Again, here's another look at that. Tyler Perry does the same thing. I'm not worried about Jeff Carroll's Medea story. I just want to write
The
a
character,
story
Medea.
and get credit by way of check. I don't need public credit because he created it.
Yeah.
My favorite brand is Star Wars. Star Wars was 3 films until a writer named Timothy Zahn wrote the Heir of the Empire.
Yeah.
And that became the first tie-in novel to 200 and counting books, umpteen cartoons, and of course, sure, he got his name on it, but it was under the Star Wars
Banner.
banner, but it was in their sandbox is the way we like to do it. I created a sandbox. Mine is post-apocalyptic America. After I get to book 4, I'm gonna open it up to other writers because I think it's a beautiful sandbox. I wanna have other writers playing it. So if you look in media tie-in writers, that's what they do. And there's nothing wrong with it, as long as you're getting paid.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You're getting the experience. So sometimes writers use different names, right? Because they are known for writing a certain category, right? But they may want to write another type of genre. So then they write and submit to James Patterson. Their books still did, you know, they can trace
And
their
what-
success.
The main important thing to
You
remember
know?
also is like you're most likely reading a story really not for the writer. You're probably reading it because you care about the characters in the story.
And the story.
So if the person cares about Alex Cross or whatever story he's going to go through, they really don't care.
Yeah,
And
Stephen
James
King,
Patterson
And that's
Stephen
what
King
Stephen
writes,
King.
he writes in a whole different genre, under a
yes.
different name.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Twilight Saga, even though it may suck to us,
I love
the 50 Shades of
Thank
Grey, 50 Shades
Oh,
of Grey.
Shade 50, yeah.
No, 50 Shades of Grey is fan fiction from Twilight, but she made it into this erotic thing.
Yeah.
But it's
She wrote
literally
it.
she wrote it off of Twilight,
And she was a
and
housewife.
she was a housewife and she loved Twilight
Technically, Twilight's a fan
and
fiction.
wrote her own
vampire.
story. Yeah, and it sold. So
Twilight's
it's,
the best.
But again, let me ask the author of the house. How, are you gonna carry your one book to a series? Or are you gonna stop, this series and then make it independent. Cause like I said, if I think it know where it came
Which
from.
book?
The one I heard you guys talking about, you got the Pope
Rock,
reads.
Rock Money Movie,
Yeah.
that'll be a series.
It is 3.
Me personally,
3.
all of my books gonna be serious because I feel like stories can keep going. You know what I'm saying? So like, what each book will be them doing something different. Like, you know what I'm saying? Within the book, they gotta,
Gonna get to the
Drags
grandchildren.
out.
yeah. You know what I'm
He
saying?
picked up the gun.
Sharice, you heard that?
Just keep it interesting is
He
all
said
I
it's gonna be
said.
3 books,
You know?
and that's all I'm looking for.
There was a comment I wanted to make to something you said earlier, and in terms of how much description are you gonna get? I think that's genre specific, right?
Agreed.
I'll give you an example. When I do my screenplays, I do them contemporary because I can't afford to build a set. I'm an independent filmmaker. I can't afford costumes, right? So I need you to be in clothes that you wear every day because my story is taking place right now.
Yeah.
Whereas if I was writing, when I write my science fiction piece, I have to tell you this on another planet. That's additional description words as opposed to me saying it was 42nd Street at 8 o'clock at night. That's all you need if it's taking place right now. You know what I'm saying? It was Opalaka on a hot Sunday. You in it. You already know. You understand what I'm saying? But if I'm writing, it was on planet Atrium and it's next to planet whatever, and this and that, you be like, well, what is planet this? You need to know. It's like the other fantasy, which is Lord of the Rings. Okay, Lord of the Rings, he actually wrote 7 books of backstory based on everything in there. Why does that work? Why is that important? Well, you don't always have to do it in prose. There's another medium called role-playing games, right?
Okay.
And in role-playing games, you need to know